Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into a research paper about enterprise process modeling today, but with a bit of a twist.
Oh,
This one focuses on healthcare,
okay.
and it introduces this idea of a situated best practice approach.
Interesting.
I don't know about you, but that caught my eye right away.
Yeah, sounds intriguing.
Plus, we've got some real-world examples from a case study at a new hospital in Norway, so this isn't just theoretical stuff.
Right. I always like seeing how these concepts play out in the real world.
Me too. So what's the big takeaway here? What did you find most interesting about this paper?
Well, they really dive into the concept of complexity, and they use healthcare as like the perfect example.
Makes sense.
Think about it. Healthcare processes are super intricate, they're constantly changing, and they involve coordinating all these different people and departments.
Yeah, that's a lot to juggle.
Exactly. And the paper argues that process modeling specifically with this ought-to-be model is key to navigating all that complexity.
Okay, ought to be model. Now, we often hear about as-is and to-be models in business process improvement.
Right.
How is this different?
So the ought-to-be model is like your ideal state. It's the gold standard of how processes should work if everything was perfect.
I see. So it's aspirational.
Yeah. You can think of it as a guiding principle driven by best practices, the latest research, even advancements in technology.
So not necessarily immediately achievable in the real world.
Right. And that's where the to-be model comes in. It acknowledges the limitations you're facing right now. Things like budget constraints, outdated systems, the culture of your organization.
Okay. The to-be model is more practical. It's
Yeah.
like the steps you can realistically take toward that ideal ought-to-be state.
Exactly.
So just to recap, as is where you are now. To be is your next target, and ought to be is that North Star you're aiming for.
Perfect summary.
Now, this case study, they looked at a brand new hospital in Norway that was merging 3 existing hospitals.
Right.
That sounds like a complex process in itself.
Oh, absolutely. Talk about a challenge. They had to figure out how to integrate all these different systems and processes from 3 separate hospitals.
Wow, so they actually put these models into practice.
Yeah, they did. They started by mapping out the as-is processes and systems in those 3 hospitals, which were probably all pretty different.
Makes sense. Each hospital likely had its own way of doing things.
Right. Then they developed an ought-to-be model based on best practices and what they wanted this new consolidated hospital to achieve.
So they had this vision for how things should ideally work.
Yeah, and then they created a to-be model outlining the initial steps to get them closer to that ideal state before the new hospital even opened its doors.
Smart. They were thinking ahead.
Absolutely.
Now, when they were doing all this modeling, were there any specific tools or techniques they used that we should know about?
Yeah, they mainly used 2 approaches. One was idea as you, which they used for the ought-to-be modeling,
Heidi's as you.
and then BPMN, which they used for the more detailed as-is and to-be workflows.
Okay, so 2 different approaches.
They found that IDAF was better for that high-level generic view of their ideal process flow, while BPMN was more useful for mapping out those specific step-by-step workflows.
So IDF Jantia for the big picture, BPMN for the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Did they just use one or the other, or did they combine them?
They really emphasized using both top-down and bottom-up approaches.
Interesting. What do they mean by that?
Well, the top-down approach is like starting with that ought-to-be model.
Right.
It's about defining your strategic goals and the overall structure you're aiming for.
Okay.
Then the bottom-up approach, which is based on your as-is analysis, keeps you grounded in the reality of your current situation.
So it's like having a blueprint and a toolbox.
Perfect analogy. You need both to actually build something.
Exactly. Now, this is where that situated best practice idea comes in.
Right.
I've been wanting to hear more about this. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it's this really interesting concept that acknowledges that best practices aren't one size fits all.
That makes sense.
Something that works perfectly in one situation might not be the best solution in another, even if it's considered a best practice.
So context matters.
Absolutely.
Right.
In the hospital example, they had to consider the unique context of each existing hospital,
Right.
plus the goals for the new consolidated hospital, and even the specific needs of the Norwegian healthcare system.
So they were adapting those best practices to their unique situation.
Exactly. They had to consider the situation and tailor those practices accordingly.
Interesting. Now, this brings us to another term from the paper that I think we should clarify. Stereotypes.
Yes.
I know that word usually has a negative connotation, but in process modeling, it's actually a good thing.
Yeah, it's totally different in this context.
So stereotypes, in a good way, What are we talking about here?
In this context, stereotypes are simply standardized definitions of common processes.
Okay.
Think of them as pre-built modules that everyone understands. So instead of reinventing the wheel every time you need to, say, admit a patient or discharge a patient, you use these standardized stereotype definitions.
Ah, so it's like having a shared language for processes,
Exactly.
which makes sense in a complex environment like a hospital.
Right. It reduces errors, ensures consistency across different departments, and makes it much easier to model those processes in a clear and concise way.
And if everyone's on the same page about what these standardized processes entail,
There you go.
it's easier to make changes or improvements down the line.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got this ought-to-be model guiding the overall vision.
Right.
We've got stereotypes providing those building blocks for standardized processes,
Yeah.
and the situated best practice approach reminding us to adapt and tailor those practices to our specific needs.
It all fits together.
What else did the researchers highlight?
Well, one thing that stood out to me was this concept of the line of visibility.
Line of visibility. What's that?
It refers to explicitly mapping the patient's journey and interactions with the hospital.
Interesting. So putting the customer, or in this case, the patient, at the heart of the process.
Exactly. It's about understanding their experience from start to finish.
So how did they actually do this?
They mapped out every step of the patient journey, from the moment they first contact the hospital all the way to their post-discharge follow-up.
Wow, that's comprehensive.
They looked at things like how easy it was to schedule appointments, how long patients waited for treatment, how smoothly information was shared between different departments, even how the hospital communicated with patients throughout the entire process.
So they really tried to see things from the patient's perspective.
Yeah, and it helped them identify potential bottlenecks and pain points that they might have otherwise missed.
Like what?
For example, they might discover that the process for scheduling appointments was overly complicated, or that patients were experiencing long wait times in certain areas.
Ah, I see. And then they could use that information to improve those specific processes.
Exactly. And that's what's so great about this approach. It's not just about optimizing individual processes as isolation.
Right.
It's about understanding how those processes connect and impact the overall patient experience.
It's a more holistic view.
Ex-
Now I'm starting to see how powerful this ought-to-be model, coupled with stereotypes and the line of visibility, can be. But is this just a healthcare thing?
Oh, no, not at all.
Could other industries benefit from this approach?
Absolutely. Any organization, regardless of industry or size, can benefit from this kind of thinking.
You think so?
I really do. Think about it. You have customers, clients, or users that you serve, right?
Oh yeah, everyone does.
So you could apply the same principles to improve their experience.
That's a good point.
Think about a process in your own work that could benefit from this approach.
Okay.
What would your ought-to-be model look like for that process?
Hmm.
What are the standardized steps or stereotypes that you could define?
Yeah.
And how can you incorporate that line of visibility to make sure you're meeting your customers' needs at every stage?
This is giving me a lot to think about.
Me too.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into enterprise process modeling, but there's more to come. Stick with us as we continue to explore this research paper and uncover even more insights that you can apply in your own work.
Looking forward to it.
Me too.
Should be good. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Now, before the break, we were talking about how this research paper challenges us to think about situated best practices
Right.
and apply those to our organizations.
Exactly.
Let's go back to that hospital case study for a second.
Okay.
I'm curious to hear how those models actually played out in practice, particularly that idea of business leaders having a greater influence on the technology side of things.
Yeah, that was a really interesting finding.
It's not every day you hear about business goals driving IT decisions instead of the other way around.
For sure. It's usually the opposite.
Right. So what did that look like in the context of this hospital project?
Well, one of the key takeaways was that this ought-to-be model really helped the hospital's leadership team get everyone on the same page.
Okay.
They were able to articulate their long-term vision for patient care in a way that resonated with the IT professionals, which led to a much more collaborative approach to system design and implementation.
So it was less about the IT department saying, here are the limits of what our current systems can do.
Yeah.
And more about everyone working together to figure out how technology could help them reach that ideal state of patient care they envisioned.
Exactly. It was about finding solutions together.
And did that lead to any specific innovations or changes?
Definitely. For example, the hospital leaders had this vision of patient data being easily accessible to all authorized healthcare providers,
Interesting.
not just within the hospital, but across the entire continuum of care.
So like a truly integrated system.
Right. And this vision actually pushed the IT team to research and invest in interoperable systems that could communicate with each other seamlessly.
Fascinating. So a clear vision of the ideal future actually spurred technological innovation.
I think so. And the researchers highlighted several other benefits too.
Hmm. Like what?
Well, for one, it helped break down those silos that often exist between different departments.
That's a common problem in a lot of organizations.
Oh, yeah, for sure. By mapping out that ideal patient journey from start to finish,
Right.
they were able to pinpoint potential bottlenecks and inefficiencies in how various departments interacted with each other and with the patients.
So it wasn't just about optimizing the processes within each department,
Right.
but about looking at how everything flowed together across the entire organization.
Exactly. It's that systems thinking approach.
I like that. And did they find any specific examples of that?
Oh, yeah. For instance, they realized that their ought-to-be model required a more integrated approach to patient intake and assessment.
So instead of each department gathering the same information from the patient multiple times,
Exactly.
they implemented a system where the information was collected once and then shared electronically across the different departments.
You got it. Which saved a ton of time, reduced redundant work, and probably improved the patient experience, too.
Yeah, I can imagine it's pretty frustrating for a patient to have to repeat their medical history and symptoms over and over again to different staff members.
Oh, I'm sure it is. So this ought-to-be thinking was clearly valuable during this big project of building a new hospital.
Right.
But did the researchers mention any downsides to this approach?
Yeah, I was wondering about that too. It sounds like it could be a lot of extra work.
They did acknowledge that maintaining a separate ought-to-be model in addition to your as-is and to-be models does require more effort and resources.
Okay, so it's not a quick fix.
No, it's not a magic bullet.
But it sounds like the potential benefits might outweigh those additional costs.
That's what the researchers concluded too. They argued that having this clear vision of the ideal future state can help organizations make more informed decisions,
That makes sense.
especially about technology and process design.
Right.
And it can help you avoid those costly rework scenarios that happen when you realize something isn't working halfway through implementation.
Ouch. Yeah, nobody wants that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it can help you achieve better results in the long run.
I see. It makes you wonder why more organizations aren't adopting this ought-to-be mindset.
Right. It seems like common sense in a way.
It does. And they had this interesting point that I think is really important,
What's that?
that the ought-to-be model shouldn't be static.
Yeah, that's key.
It should evolve as technology changes, new best practices emerge, and your organizational goals shift over time.
Absolutely. It's not a one and done kind of thing.
So it's a living document,
Right. You got to keep it updated.
not something you just create once and then forget about.
Exactly. And this actually brings us back to those standardized process definitions, the stereotypes we talked about earlier.
Right.
By using a common language for processes, organizations can ensure consistency and make it easier to communicate even as the details of their ought-to-be model are being refined and updated.
It's like having a strong foundation that you can build upon as your needs change.
A very good analogy. You don't have to start from scratch every time.
Now I'm starting to see how all of these pieces fit together.
Me too.
The ought-to-be model as that guiding vision, the to-be model for those achievable steps and stereotypes, serving as those essential building blocks
Right.
for creating a well-defined and adaptable process architecture. It's actually quite elegant when you think about it.
It is. It's a really thoughtful approach.
And the great thing is that it's not just limited to healthcare.
Nope, not at all.
Any organization, no matter what industry they're in or how big or small they are, can benefit from this way of thinking.
I agree.
It's about looking beyond the limitations of your current situation and imagining a future where your processes are optimized. Technology works for you instead of against you.
Right.
And your customers, whether they're patients, clients, or users, are at the center of everything you do.
That's the goal.
That's a powerful message. And it seems like the case study provides some solid evidence to support it.
It does. Now, before we move on, I wanted to touch on something the paper mentioned briefly. This idea of explicitly modeling the patient processes, or what we might call the customer journey, in other contexts.
Interesting. Why did they emphasize this? And what did it actually involve?
Well, I think it highlights a really important shift in how we think about process improvement. It's acknowledging that processes don't exist in a vacuum.
Okay.
They always involve interactions with people outside of the organization.
Right. The customers or users.
Exactly. And those interactions can make or break the effectiveness of the entire process.
So in the hospital example, it wasn't just about mapping out what happened within the hospital walls,
Right.
but also understanding how patients interacted with the healthcare system before they even arrived at the hospital during their stay and after they were discharged.
Precisely. They were looking at the entire patient journey.
Interesting. So what kinds of things did they map out?
Well, they might map out the steps a patient goes through to schedule an appointment,
Okay.
gather their medical records, or even manage their medications after they leave the hospital.
So really getting into the details of the patient experience.
Yeah, and by understanding these patient processes, the hospital could identify opportunities to improve communication, reduce wait times, and make the whole experience more seamless and patient-centered.
It's like taking a walk in the patient's shoes to see the process from their perspective.
Exactly. And it can be really eye-opening.
I bet. And it reinforces a key principle of process improvement,
Which,
is focusing on the end-to-end experience, not just optimizing individual tasks or departments in isolation.
you got it. It's about the big picture.
This is making me think about how we can apply this kind of ought-to-be thinking beyond just business processes.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Could we use vision for what you want to achieve and then creating a realistic roadmap to get there?
Exactly. And it's important to remember that it's a journey.
Okay,
There will be bumps in the road, and you might need to adjust your to-be model along the way.
right. Things don't always go according to plan.
But by keeping that ought-to-be vision in mind, you can stay focused and motivated even when things get challenging.
That's a great reminder. This conversation has given me so much to think about. I'm already starting to brainstorm how I can apply these concepts in my own life and work. But before I get carried away, I know our listeners are probably eager to hear about the more practical side of all this. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been talking a lot about this ought-to-be model and all these different concepts,
Yeah, a lot of great stuff in this paper.
but I'm ready to get practical.
Okay, me too. Let's do it.
For those of us ready to roll up our sleeves and start improving processes, what are some concrete steps we can take? Where do we even begin?
Well, the first step is getting the right people together.
Okay, makes sense.
You need a diverse group that represents different perspectives and roles within your organization.
So not just the managers or the tech experts,
Yeah.
but people from the front lines who actually do the work every day.
Exactly. They often have insights that others might miss.
Okay, so assemble the team, then what?
Then you need to define the scope. Which processes are you targeting? What are your desired outcomes?
So this is where that ought-to-be thinking comes into play.
Exactly. Envision that ideal state before you get bogged down in the details.
Got it. What's next?
Once you have that North Star, you can start mapping out the current as-is process.
And how do we do that?
Well, don't just rely on existing documentation. Go observe the process in action. Talk to the people involved. You'll often uncover hidden complexities or workarounds that aren't captured on paper.
Ah, so it's like detective work for process improvement.
Yeah, kind of. You got to get your hands dirty.
I like that.
Yeah.
So we've gathered the team, defined the scope, mapped out the as-is process.
Right.
Now what?
Now you can start brainstorming ways to improve it.
Okay, brainstorming time.
This is where those stereotype process definitions can come in handy. Are there any common tasks or sub-processes that can be standardized? Can you use technology to automate certain steps or improve data sharing?
So it's like taking those building blocks and assembling them in a way that supports that big picture ought-to-be model.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to challenge assumptions. Just because a process has always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way.
Yep.
Think outside the box experiment and always keep that desired outcome in mind.
This is making me think about my own work. I can totally see how these principles apply to tackling projects or even organizing my to-do list.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's not just for
For a
businesses.
second. What about the human element?
Ah, yes, that's crucial.
We talked about the importance of getting different perspectives, but are there other things to keep in mind when you're trying to improve processes?
Definitely. Communication and empathy are essential throughout the whole process.
Hmm,
Remember, you're not just optimizing for efficiency.
right.
You're creating a process that works for the people involved.
The people who actually have to use it every day.
Exactly. So get their input, address their concerns, and make sure they understand how the changes will benefit them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And it goes back to that idea of the line of visibility,
Right.
keeping the customer or the end user at the heart of the process.
Exactly. Now, one final point.
Okay, shoot.
Process improvement is an ongoing journey, not a one-time project.
That's a good point.
Don't expect to get it perfect on the first try.
Huh.
Implement your changes, gather feedback, and then refine the process based on what you learn.
So it's a continuous cycle of learning and improvement.
Exactly. You're
Uh,
always iterating.
What I'm taking away from all of this is that having a clear vision, using those standardized stereotypes, and remembering to look at things from the customer's perspective are all key to successful process improvement.
I agree with all of that.
Whether you're working in healthcare, planning a vacation, or tackling any other process in your life.
Those principles apply across the board.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into enterprise process modeling.
It's been my pleasure.
I don't know about you, but I've learned a ton.
Me too. It's been a great discussion.
We hope you've gained some valuable insights that you can put into practice. Until next time, keep exploring and keep pushing for better processes in your world.